And so with glass ionomers, one of the first bioactive materials we ever had, doesn't require bonding agents, doesn't create MMP problems, doesn't create C factor stresses, doesn't have polymerization stress and shrinkage like typical materials, but it actually helps the tooth, and it acts very much the same as dentin, which we talked about earlier. So I can do a bulk increment of glass ionomer either to the enamel surface based on the occlusion type, or just to replace the dentin and then put some composite on top, whether it be the new injectables or traditional composite. And so where I'm still implementing this because of its ability to truly help the dentin, and should my resin on top of it break down or fail, I can leave the glass ionomer behind and not have to go all the way down to the pulpal floor and potentially create more problems when I go to retrieve things. Okay? So their ability to help the tooth is phenomenal. And there's been plenty of studies over the years, going all the way back into the 70s, talking about leakage with glass ionomers compared to resins. We know the inherent problems of resins. We know in dye penetration studies, we can see leakage. In optical coherence tomography studies, we see failures. It's never been relieved. It's always there until we come up with better technology. Another study that talks about it, basically it said down here at the bottom that both light-cured and self-cured glass ionomers were more resistant to microleakage than a flowable resin on both occlusal cavo and proximal cavo surfaces. And so where I hear a lot of people say glass ionomers don't work, everything works in the right place and how it's implemented, okay? But there's plenty of studies that support glass ionomers are still phenomenal and still should be considered as wonderful dentin replacements. Where we have failures in resins, such as we saw earlier, and we can see it in SEMs, you can see it here, that again, it proves what the optical coherence tomography had shown us, that you get failures usually on the pulpal floor, where the material is literally pulled off the floor. And so because of that shrinkage stress, you have a micro opening. If that's a class 1, it doesn't matter. If that's a class 2, that's a problem because bacteria and things can get in there now. And just because you have this doesn't mean you have discomfort. For the same token, you can say like, well, glass ionomers, they actually create an acid-base resistant zone. So they've actually helped the dentin. They've made the dentin stronger and different because of actually coming in contact with them. And so you have potential better tooth structure because of implementing this type of material. So where you may have, let's say, a deeper preparation like this that has deeper dentin closer to the pulp, you have more risk of failure in the future. Maybe that first increment as a glass ionomer, I got a little pulpal protectant there, but maybe a glass ionomer as your first increment might be faster and easier and give some distinct benefit to that patient. And then you just have a 2 millimeter defect or less that you do your traditional etching, bonding, and either your injectable or traditional composite. And you've got a pretty solid technique there that can last very well for most people. Okay? So things to consider, some glass ionomers are not a bad thing. Resins have evolved, glass ionomers have evolved. And where we used to think of glass ionomers being these weak materials, we know that nowadays they can be placed in larger restorations, provided they don't have heavy occlusion on them. They can be in occlusion. They can have some load to them. So where we can use things like the EQUIA Forte HT for many of these different types of scenarios, they can hold up well. Knowing that we can utilize these, you can see examples both in my cases and many others where we've done either quadrant buildups or large cores, and they're still in place, 10 plus years later. I've got predecessors to this material that have been around for 18 years that are still working well in the right environment. Not that it's going to work for everyone every time, but in certain places it can work well. And so, for example, large defect like this, first increment being a big piece of glass ionomer, conventional glass ionomer, followed by a composite on top. Now, the tooth behind this, the second molar, that's an MO glass ionomer by itself. There's no resin on top. When we look at this one 10 years later, this is older technology. You can see not only is the composite still doing fine with glass ionomer underneath, but also just the glass ionomer by itself as a class 2 is doing fine. Okay. So there's a lot of great materials that we can be implementing nowadays, but oftentimes we don't think about it. We think more about resins and bulk materials. And bulk materials have continued to change since we have these wonderful injectable materials that we talked about.